morning everyone, and welcome to my web series Abnormal Psychobio. For those of you tuning in for the first time, this show is usually geared toward defining various psychological disorders, explaining their etiologies, paying particular attention to the neurological aspects, and outlining the existing treatment options. However, this week is going to be just a little bit different as we approach addiction.
Doctor give me prescription, a bottle of rum a day, 2 bottle of rum a day, 3 bottle of rum a day. This one called distress medication, a bottle of rum a day, 2 bottle of rum a day, 3 bottle of rum.
According to the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is somewhat of a Bible for psychologists, addiction is considered to be a psychological disorder. And so what we are going to be doing today is basically debunking the myth that addiction is caused by having low levels of self-control and or willpower. We're going to do this by showing that there are underlying neurological processes involved. In its simplest terms, addiction can be defined as compulsive behaviors directed toward obtaining a particular effect despite adverse consequences. The region of the brain associated with addiction is found in the midbrain and is known as the brain reward pathway. The main structures that make up this pathway are the ventral tegmental area, or the VTA, the ventral striatum, the nucleus accumbens, and the prefrontal cortex. Ideally, the brain reward pathway functions to reinforce behaviors that are essential for survival by making it both pleasurable and memorable. For instance, if you are eating, drinking, having sex, or interacting, all behaviors essential for survival, the brain reward pathway becomes activated, generating action potentials in the cells of the VTA, allowing for the release of dopamine into the synaptic cleft. These dopamine molecules bind to special protein receptors found on the surface of the cell membrane of the nucleus accumbens. This triggers a pleasurable feeling. Conditioning comes into play here as the brain learns to associate the pleasurable feeling with the behavior that inspired it, increasing the likelihood that it would be repeated. Any excess dopamine molecules that remain in the synaptic cleft are reabsorbed into the presynaptic neuron by dopamine transporters, where they await re-release when the neuron is once again stimulated. This process is what most drugs take over and alter.
Some drugs such as alcohol, heroin, and nicotine indirectly excite the dopamine-producing neurons in the VTA so that they generate more action potentials. Cocaine acts at the nerve terminal. It binds to dopamine transporter and blocks the reuptake of dopamine. Methamphetamine, a psychostimulant, acts similarly to cocaine in blocking dopamine removal. In addition, it can enter the neuron into the dopamine-containing vesicles, where it triggers dopamine release even in the absence of action potentials. Different drugs act in different ways, but the common outcome is that dopamine builds up in the synapse to a much greater amount than normal. This causes a continuous stimulation, maybe overstimulation of receiving neurons, and is responsible for prolonged and intense euphoria experienced by drug users. Repeated exposure to dopamine surges caused by drugs eventually desensitizes the reward system. The system is no longer responsive to everyday stimuli. The only thing that is rewarding is the drug. That is how drugs change the person's life priority. After some time, even the drug loses its ability to reward, and higher doses are required to achieve the rewarding effect. This ultimately leads to drug overdose.
Some research has also suggested that low levels of serotonin plays a part in addiction.
Mr. Blue and Mr. Red. Red has a relatively normal brain terrain with the right levels of serotonin and dopamine. Blue, on the other hand, is an addict. He has a nucleus accumbens hypersensitive to dopamine and low baseline serotonin levels. The two crave an ice-cold beer after work. At this point, both are craving in exactly the same way. The difference we see is after each gets what they want. Blue, with low serotonin never feels satiated. So even when he has beer after beer, there is not enough serotonin to tell him he has had enough. On the other hand, Red wanted one beer and one beer was enough. He had enough serotonin to make him feel satiated. The conclusion here, based on neurological and clinical research, is that a brain with a nucleus accumbens hypersensitive to dopamine plus low baseline serotonin levels equals addiction.
Therefore, what I've just illustrated is that in light of research that implicates the involvement of neurological processes in the development of addiction, this disorder easily transcends the widely held theory of poor self-management that was once assumed to have caused it.